Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Joe Biden over at G7 across the pond in England. And after he got done elbow bumping all the world leaders in attendance, and I think they all had an opportunity to also bitch slap Emmanuel Macron, just in principle, like the French are doing.
And the main theme is America's back at the table. Mm-hmm. Oh, really? Do we ever leave?
He was asked, was Joe Biden, about Trump-era steel and aluminum tariffs on EU countries, and he had this to say to reporters.
When you're having these conversations with European allies who are very concerned about these sanctions, how do you justify that? And what are your plans to
120 days. Give me a break. Need time.
Dear, what was that? Was it Clint Eastwood? Get off my lawn.
120 days. In addition to the dramatic Vader voice.
Yeah, he's a victim now too.
120 days. You've been in office for 50 years. What is complicated about the decision on steel and aluminum tariffs? How many days does it take? It's buffoonery. And that was complemented by his robust discussion of Russia as it relates to countries in the region and opportunities for America to work with Russia, even though Russia's not a good faith actor.
Where we could work together with Russia. For example, in Libya,
Syria.
We should be opening up the passes to be able to go through and provide food assistance and vital assistance to a population that's in real trouble. I think I'm going to try very much hard to. It is. And by the way, there's places where I shouldn't be starting off and negotiating in public here, but let me say it this way: Russia has engaged in activities which we believe are contrary to international norms, but they have also bitten off some real problems they're going to have trouble chewing on. And for example, the rebuilding of Syria,
Syria.
They're there, and as long as they're there without the ability to bring about some order in the region, and you can't do that very well without providing for the basic economic needs of people. So I'm hopeful that we can find an accommodation where we can save the lives of people in, for example, in
Syria,
in Libya.
In Syria.
No one's spoken his ear like, sir, you have the wrong country.
I think he should redraw that red line that Obama drew in Syria, but this time draw it in Libya. For more on this, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, author of the recently released Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good to be with you. That was just painful to listen to. I got to tell you.
Sounds like Biden was biting off more than he was able to chew as well.
So I had, I did a piece for Fox that's coming out. I kind of like 3 takeaways from the G7. One of them actually you just played there, which is, ironically, kind of the dopey grandpa thing works. I mean, everybody is, Biden is his public, well, he's actually not a pleasant guy, but his public persona is quite pleasant. And that plays. Actually, the other president who did this was Eisenhower. When Eisenhower came into office, he famously kind of adopted this kind of, grandpa thing, and it worked. And the Cold War was heating up. Americans kind of needed that calming influence. But Eisenhower famously had this very hard hidden hand. So behind the scenes, he was a very strong, proactive president, and actually produced some of the best bipartisan initiatives in modern history. The problem with Biden is, I think, behind the scenes, we aren't seeing a strong hidden hand that's pressing good bipartisan things. So one is, I think that's the whole, we love the dopey grandpa thing, that's going to work then. The second one is Biden is really good at finger waving and magical thinking. And so far, that seems to be most of our foreign policy. This notion about about Syria, for example, which is utter nonsense. So in the end, what you're saying is we will help the Russians strengthen the totalitarian genocidal regime in Syria, because that's really all the Russians are interested in. And there is no common ground between the United States and Putin. It's nonsensical to do that, but basically what we have from the president is a lot of kind of rhetoric, which is either kind of finger waving, well, I told him not to do that, like you tell the kids not to mess up the living room even as they're tearing the couch apart, or this kind of magical thinking like, oh yeah, we'll figure things out. I think the third thing, which doesn't get enough coverage here, is a lot of this is just this administration using foreign affairs as to legitimatize a very aggressive domestic agenda. I think the number one thing where we saw that with the climate change, for example, which is really nothing about global climate leadership. It's about an excuse to do all kinds of nutty stuff here at home. I think we saw the same thing at the G7, this discussion about global minimum corporate tax. That's just about looking for international validation on corporate tax as government, as a key government policy, an excuse that he'll use when he comes back here home. So, we have to do this because we have to, purport to global norms. So
well, it looked like the world leaders at the G7 summit were, falling all over themselves to be with Biden and to, make it look like everything's better in the world. So has America's image really improved since Biden took office, or is that just for show?
Well, so that's super interesting because there was some polling that came out which says Biden has kind of introduced this more interesting, more popular image of the U.S. abroad. But what's really interesting is when you go underneath those numbers, there's actually less confidence in American leadership. There's less confidence in American democracy. There's less confidence that America is going to do good things in the world. So it goes back to this. We all love the kindly grandpa thing, but actually we hate Biden's policy. We actually did a piece on this on the Daily Signal over the weekend. If you look at the kind of the 12 top issues in America, from voter integrity to Antifa and BLM in our streets, Americans and Joe Biden are on a completely different page. His popularity is still hovering at like 50%. But when you actually ask, do you like Biden's policies, he just falls off the cliff.
And so Biden is behaving the same way these mealy-mouthed other Western leaders behave with respect to the Chinese communists. They sort of mumble about consulting and collaboration and accountability, and they don't really mean any of it because they're not willing to risk the economic relationship. And this is where the rest of the West wants America to be the bad guy, and Joe Biden is not going to be the bad guy with respect to the Chinese communists or the Russians, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this in spades. We came out with a joint statement that says we want the WHO to investigate COVID and we want China to cooperate. The two things that we know will never happen, right? And then we all pat ourselves on the back like, aren't we strong? I mean, what nonsense! I mean, look, Beijing's getting ready to host the world's most important sporting event on the Earth, in the universe, and they're in the midst of not only having created a global pandemic, but in one of the world's most atrocious genocides. And we're all just going to go to Beijing and pretend that didn't happen. The G7 could have said, you know what, we, the G7, demand that the Olympic Committee postpone and move the Olympics. They could have done that. That would have angered China to no end. That would have got their attention. But this was mostly, the G7 has always been kind of a nothing burger with a side of nothing. This one, I think, in some ways is even worse than that. It reminds me of the little kid in the grocery cart steering the little wheel, thinking he's driving the grocery cart down the aisle.
Well,
it's
worse because it's emboldening the West's enemies and America's enemies in particular.
I do think, yeah. I mean, I think part of the reason why the Europeans are all enamored with Biden is they just think he is a tool they can kind of drive around. Certainly Macron thinks that oh my God, I have a kind of absent-minded Chartsy Gardner American president who I can play like a puppet. This is awesome. But and I think it's either that or we need America, much in the way many, European leaders or foreign leaders were kind of had awkward relationships with Trump. They still had very strong working relationships because they needed America. So there's nothing good that came out of the G7 that we can all go to and say, yes, Russia, China, and Iran are all hovering around their desks saying, oh my God, how are we going to deal with these guys? It's exactly the opposite. I think they're all thinking like, well, what can we get away with next?
All right, so Vladimir Putin told NBC News that U.S. relations with Russia is at a low point. Biden is refusing to have a press conference with him, but he wants answers about cyber criminals. And Russia said, yeah, we'll give you the information if you give us information. But why not stand side by side with him in person and ask him directly while the whole world is watching?
Because the whole purpose of this trip was to just roll Biden out there and kind of look presidential and get away with the minimum amount of risk and gas. And so this is just minimizing exposure.
With respect to issues at home within our government, more and more information coming out about the relationship between scientists at the National Institutes for Health and at the Wuhan Virology Lab. And something, and this is, I don't think, been covered very much, but the National Pulse had it. Dr. Richard Barrick, who was one of the scientists named by Rand Paul in that now infamous exchange he had with Tony Fauci that has led to all of this additional investigation that is unearthing all of the conferences and cozy remarks that were the bon mots shared back and forth between Chinese scientists and American scientists over the last decade plus, including on the topic of gain-of-function research, which Dr. Richard Barrick, opposed the moratorium on gain-of-function research. But something he said during a 2018 speech, imagining the next flu pandemic and preventing it, that was the title of his talk. There was a slide in his presentation, Global Catastrophe, Opportunities Exist. The slide outlines what type of stocks and industries surged during the Ebola outbreak, which he uses to extrapolate financial advice on how to make money in the next pandemic. I'm quoting him. I want to give you good news. There are winners out there, right? So if you ever want to be prepared and make money in the next pandemic, if that's what you want to do, buy stock in hazmat suit makers and protective clothing or companies that make antiviral drugs for the particular pandemic. He added that those sectors and stocks would probably do pretty well, quote unquote, and they're actually mutual funds for pandemic preparedness, he noted as well. It's interesting to have Dr. Richard Barrick, this scientist in the infectious disease space, offering in a conference about pandemics just 3 years ago, this financial advice about how to make money to those in attendance at the conference. Did you find that troubling at all?
Well, it seems inappropriate. I would also say it also seems pretty freaking obvious that in a pandemic, people that make personal protective stuff is going to be. But the other problem, of course, is and this is the one thing people should not forget. And look, all diseases present themselves differently. So how you dealt with the last pandemic may or may not be, or the next disease outbreak may or may not be appropriate for the next one, because viruses behave differently. There's some are airborne transmission, some are transmitted by services. So, I think we do have to be careful that somehow that we've learned on the lessons here. But there seems to be a major problem here in that it looks like for at least 15 years, we have had relatively reckless interchanges on the scientific level with China and other people. And I'm not sure we've adhered to ethical standards. I'm not sure we've adopted best practices. I'm not sure we've done due diligence on all these things. And what's really interesting is I've heard people in Congress incessantly demand an investigation of January 6th, but you have a pandemic that's killed 600,000 people, and every day we have new questions about the appropriateness and of how we prepared, and nobody wants to investigate that.
Yeah, something else too. There's a good piece by Perry Link, who's a professor of Chinese at University of California, Riverside. It's amazing to me how little our diplomatic corps either knows or pretends to know about how the Chinese communists operate. he points out that the linguistic evidence is overwhelming that Chinese leaders believed the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the source. Many years ago, a distinguished Chinese writer explained to me there is truth in Communist Party pronouncements, but you have to read them upside down.
Right.
And he goes on to say, this Chinese writer told him, you're too hung up, you in the West, too hung up on the question whether propaganda is true or not. For the regime, truth and falsity are beside the point. A statement might be true, false, or partly true. What matters is only whether it works. Does it advance the interests of the party? And so we're taking, so many people, at least in public, are taking statements emanating from the Chinese Politburo at face value.
Face value, right.
When in point of fact, we know that they're not to be taken at face value.
Yeah, and the reality is look, our intelligence community knows that. My guys who work on this stuff know that. We know that, and yet at a global forum, the U.S. government says the route to understanding what happened here is we have to have the WHO investigate more, and the Chinese have to cooperate, knowing for a fact that both those things are absolutely off the table with the Chinese government. And does that not make us look just idiotic? Not just in the minds of the Chinese government, but anybody with half a brain.
Well, it also indicates that you have people purposely lying to their constituents, meaning those people saying that, the Biden administration officials saying that, are lying to the American people. And that's terribly problematic.
Well, they've been lying. Look, this is part of the shtick. They completely fabricated the response to the border. Look, this is, we found basically that for 4 years we relied to virtually everything about Trump, that Trump didn't do anything as they claimed he did. Mm-hmm. And now, but what we learned in those 4 years is you can lie to people for a really long time and get away with it. And that's what they're doing coming out of the box. They lied that HR 1 and HR 4 are about voting integrity. They're not. They're about a power grab. They lied that the infrastructure bill is about infrastructure. It's not. They lied that the COVID response bill was about COVID response. It wasn't. They said the border was just a temporary seasonal blip. That's a lie. And these actually are lies. It's not even manipulating the truth, and some of these are just lies.
No,
so when the National Security Advisor gets up and says we're going to press the Chinese to come clean and the WHO to investigate this, he knows that's not going to happen. That's a lie to the American people. Well,
when people make comparisons between the Democrat Socialists and the Maoists of the Cultural Revolution era, that's more spot on than they'd like to admit, isn't it? Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at Heritage and author of the book Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
With the value of the U.S. dollar continuing to slump due to unprecedented money printing, it has never been more important to protect your savings and retirement accounts from inflation. Many hardworking Americans, just like you and I, are turning to a proven method